They said a dog never forgets a voice it once trusted, but sometimes memory doesn't return in loyalty. It returns in silence. The morning sun had just begun to rise over the edges of the base, stretching pale gold light across rows of concrete buildings and parked military vehicles that sat motionless like they were holding their breath. A light wind carried the scent of dust, metal, and distant pine trees from beyond the perimeter fence, folding itself into the quiet rhythm of a place that was always alert even when nothing seemed to move. That was when he appeared. A German shepherd stepped through the main entry gate without hesitation, his coat unusually pale, almost white under the sunlight, catching every reflection like a ghost passing through memory. No leash, no handler, no visible insignia that explained where he came from or why he walked as if he already belonged there. The guard at the gate paused mid-motion, hand hovering near his radio, eyes narrowing in confusion rather than alarm, because something about the animal felt familiar yet impossible to place. The dog did not react to the attention. He did not stop. He simply continued forward, paws steady against the pavement, moving with a calm that felt learned rather than accidental. Inside the base, conversation slowed without reason, heads turning as Marines noticed the shape crossing their field of view. It was not uncommon to see working dogs here, but this was different. There was no handler call, no command voice, no training leash tension guiding his direction. It was as if he was following something only he could sense. Near the central yard, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole stepped out from a maintenance building, a man whose presence carried the quiet weight of long service and longer silence. His posture straightened instinctively the moment his eyes landed on the approaching figure, though for a brief second he could not understand why his chest felt heavier. The dog slowed as well, just slightly, as if acknowledging a shift in the air, but still did not stop. Ethan squinted into the light, studying the animal's face, searching for recognition that refused to surface cleanly. There was something about the shape of the ears, the way the head tilted ever so slightly as it scanned the environment, that tugged at something buried deep behind years of disciplined memory. Around them, the base continued its routine, unaware that something unresolved had just walked back into it. A young soldier nearby muttered a question under his breath, but no one answered. The dog's steps carried him closer to the center of the yard where the wind moved more freely, lifting faint dust into spirals that broke apart as quickly as they formed. Ethan took a slow step forward without realizing it, then another, not because he had been instructed to, but because something in him refused to stay still. The distance between them was still enough to feel like space, but not enough to feel like separation. The dog finally stopped, standing under the open sky, head angled slightly upward as if listening to something no one else could hear. Ethan's breath tightened in a way he could not explain, his eyes fixed on the animal's face, searching for an answer that had not yet been spoken. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The base around them continued to exist, but it felt quieter now, as if the world itself had chosen to wait. And in that suspended silence, something unspoken lingered between a man who had returned from his duties and AK-9 who had arrived from a place no one had accounted for, carrying with him the weight of 3 years no one seemed ready to remember. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt like something waiting to be named, as if the air itself was holding back a memory that refused to surface all at once. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole stood still in the center of the yard, his boots planted on the worn concrete as the morning light continued to rise, softening the edges of everything it touched, yet not softening the strange pressure building in his chest. The German shepherd remained in place as well, unmoving now, his pale coat shimmering faintly whenever the wind passed through, lifting strands of fur like threads of forgotten time. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, studying the animal with the patience of someone trained to observe. Without assumption, but there was something about the way the dog held himself that resisted logic. It was not just posture or training, it was presence, as if the animal was waiting for permission from something deeper than voice commands. A distant engine hummed somewhere near the motor pool, but even that sound felt far away, swallowed by the quiet tension between man and dog. Ethan took another step forward, slower this time, not because he was unsure of his footing, but because something in him hesitated in recognition without clarity. The dog's ears shifted subtly, reacting not to motion, but to intention, and for a brief moment his head tilted in a way that felt almost like inquiry, not obedience. That small gesture struck Ethan harder than he expected, not because it was unusual, but because it was familiar in a way he could not immediately explain. His mind began searching through layers of memory, not names at first, but sensations, places, fragments of time that carried weight without detail. Heat-pressed sand from a distant deployment, the sound of boots moving in synchronized silence, the faint crackle of radio static cutting through night operations, and always, somewhere within those fragments, the presence of a partner who moved beside him without hesitation. A flash of memory surfaced suddenly, not as a full scene, but as a feeling, a battlefield corridor of dust and wind where a white-coated German shepherd once moved ahead of him without fear, clearing space between danger and survival with instinct sharper than instruction. Ethan's breath slowed as that memory brushed against the present, but he did not speak it aloud, as if naming it too quickly might break it. The dog in front of him shifted his weight slightly, one paw pressing forward and then settling again, as though testing whether time itself would respond. Around them, life on the base continued in small, unnoticed motions, a door closing somewhere behind a distant building, a radio call echoing briefly before dissolving into static, a flag moving gently at half-mast height against a pale sky. Yet none of it mattered in that narrow space of recognition forming between them. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly to the ground, then back to the dog's eyes, and that was when he saw it, not in movement, but in stillness, a recognition buried so deep it almost looked like absence. The dog's eyes were steady, pale amber catching light differently than he remembered, yet carrying the same unsettling awareness that once seemed to anticipate his thoughts before commands were spoken. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice almost forming a name before stopping at the edge of sound, because certainty still had not fully arrived. The German shepherd did not move closer, but he did not retreat either, maintaining a distance that felt intentional, as though the space between them was part of something unresolved rather than unknown. A faint breeze crossed the yard again, and with it came the scent of dry earth and metal, and something else that lingered only for a second before disappearing, something Ethan could not name, but felt in the back of his memory like a door slightly opening. He reached slowly toward his belt without thinking, fingers brushing against the worn edge of a metal tag he had carried longer than he cared to admit, and the moment it made a faint sound against his gear, the dog's ears reacted instantly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it changed the air between them. Ethan froze, not in fear, but in recognition that something had answered him without words. The dog finally took one step forward, then stopped again, watching him carefully, as if confirming that the man in front of him was not a stranger shaped like memory, but memory itself returning in a form that required patience to understand. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not from tension, but from the effort of holding emotion steady under discipline, because whatever was happening here was not immediate. It was unfolding, layer by layer, like something buried returning slowly to the surface after years beneath silence. And in that moment, neither of them moved again, because both seemed to understand without speaking that recognition, when it finally came, would not arrive as a sudden answer, but as something remembered piece by piece through the space they were now willing to stand inside together. The space between them seemed to tighten, not physically, but in a way that made the surrounding world feel slightly more distant, as if everything outside that moment had been lowered in volume. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole kept his position steady, though his attention had narrowed completely onto the German shepherd standing only a few yards away. The animal had not moved again, but the stillness was no longer neutral. It carried weight, like a decision being made without words. Ethan's hand remained near his belt, resting lightly where the faint sound of metal had already drawn a reaction from the dog, and that detail continued to echo in his thoughts longer than it should have. He studied the dog's face more carefully now, not searching for familiarity in general shape or coat, but in the smallest expressions that might break the uncertainty. The eyes were calm, but not empty. They held a kind of restraint that felt practiced, as if emotion was being held behind discipline rather than absence. A breeze moved across the yard again, shifting dust in slow arcs across the concrete, And for a moment, Ethan's mind returned to another place entirely, not as a full memory, but as fragments aligning themselves without permission. Heat pressed against sand under a foreign sky, the low sound of coordinated movement through terrain, the steady presence of a partner who never waited for instruction when instinct already understood the path forward. He blinked once, and the present returned with sharper clarity, the base around him unchanged, but his awareness altered. The German shepherd took another step forward, slower than before, stopping again at a distance that felt deliberate rather than hesitant. Ethan noticed that now. It was not caution. It was recognition being tested, measured in space instead of words. Somewhere behind him, a door closed softly, followed by the faint shuffle of boots on pavement, but no one approached. It was as if everyone else had unconsciously decided to observe without interrupting something they did not fully understand. Ethan exhaled through his nose, steadying himself, then lowered his voice without fully realizing. He was about to speak. The sound came out controlled, almost procedural, as if he were addressing a unit rather than an uncertain memory standing in front of him. The dog's ears shifted immediately, responding not to volume but to tone, and that reaction tightened something in Ethan's chest. He repeated nothing, but instead let silence stretch again, and in that silence, the dog took a small step forward, then paused once more. This time, the distance between them felt different. Not smaller, but charged, like something suspended just before confirmation. Ethan's thoughts drifted again, sharper this time, to a night he had not revisited in detail for a long time, when movement and sound had been reduced to instinct and trust alone. He remembered issuing commands in low tones, not because of authority, but because the environment demanded precision without excess. And somewhere within that memory, there had been a presence moving alongside him that responded not just to commands, but to intent itself. His eyes narrowed slightly as that realization brushed closer to surface awareness. The German shepherd tilted his head just slightly, as if reading the shift in Ethan's expression. The base around them remained active in its routine rhythm, but that rhythm now felt secondary, like background noise to something more focused and contained. Ethan finally let his hand drop away from his belt, slowly, deliberately, as if removing tension might allow clarity to form more easily. The dog did not retreat. Instead, he shifted his stance again, grounding himself more firmly on the concrete. And in that motion, there was something unmistakably trained, not casual, not stray, not accidental. Ethan took a single step forward now, closing the distance by only a small margin, and stopped. The dog mirrored the pause almost immediately. That synchrony, subtle and unspoken, carried more weight than anything that had happened since the moment this encounter began. Ethan's throat tightened slightly, but his expression remained controlled, shaped by years of discipline that refused to break under uncertainty. Yet behind that control, something old and deeply buried pressed forward, not as emotion first, but as recognition trying to find permission to become real. The wind passed through again, softer now, and for the first time since the beginning of this encounter, Ethan felt as though the silence between them was no longer resisting understanding. It was waiting for it. The moment stretched longer than either of them seemed prepared to acknowledge, as if time itself had slowed down inside the small, invisible corridor between man and dog. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole stood still, his posture unchanged on the surface, yet every part of his awareness now sharpened around the German shepherd in front of him. The animal's presence no longer felt like a question alone. It felt like something that had already been answered somewhere in the past, and was only now returning to the present in fragments. Ethan's eyes lowered briefly, not breaking contact, but softening his focus as if trying to see beyond the physical form into something deeper. The dog remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in his weight, a grounding motion that suggested awareness of observation rather than reaction to it. The base around them continued its quiet operations, distant vehicle movement, faint radio chatter, and the occasional sound of boots on pavement, yet all of it felt separated now, as if wrapped in layers of glass. Ethan's mind drifted again, not by choice, but by the pressure of recognition building beneath restraint. He remembered colder nights in unfamiliar terrain, where visibility was reduced to shapes and instinct, and where survival depended on trust that did not require explanation. In those memories, there had always been a presence moving beside him, not ahead, not behind, but aligned, as if understanding had replaced instruction entirely. His jaw tightened slightly as the thought surfaced more clearly than before. The German shepherd in front of him shifted his head again, this time slower, almost cautious, and Ethan noticed something he had missed before. There was a faint asymmetry in the way the dog stood, not a flaw, but a mark of adaptation, as if experience had shaped posture rather than training alone. Ethan took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and allowed himself to step forward again, closing the distance by another small measure. The dog did not retreat. Instead, he held position, watching with an intensity that felt less like assessment and more like memory trying to align itself. Ethan stopped again, now closer than before, and for the first time the space between them felt thin enough to carry meaning without sound. His voice did not come immediately. It formed gradually, restrained by discipline, yet softened by something that had not been used in a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not a command, and not a question, but a name that carried weight he had not fully prepared to release. The name entered the air quietly, almost fragile against the open space of the yard. The German shepherd reacted immediately, not with movement at first, but with stillness so precise it felt like recognition had struck without warning. His ears lifted slightly, then angled forward, and his eyes locked onto Ethan with a focus that removed every trace of uncertainty from the moment. For a brief second, nothing else moved. The bass, the wind, the distant activity, all of it seemed to fade into background silence that no longer mattered. Ethan did not repeat the name. He simply waited, watching for something that could confirm what logic had not yet fully accepted. The dog took one step forward, slower than any movement before, then paused again. But this time the pause was different. It was not hesitation. It was transition. Ethan's chest tightened subtly as he noticed the shift, not because the dog had approached, but because of the way he had approached him, as if crossing a boundary that had existed long before either of them had arrived here. A faint sound came from the dog, low and controlled, not a bark, not a whine, but something closer to breath held too long and finally released. Ethan's eyes softened despite himself, and for the first time since the encounter began, he allowed stillness to become something other than uncertainty. The distance between them was now small enough that every detail mattered, the rise and fall of breath, the subtle tension in muscle, the almost imperceptible hesitation before trust could fully return. Ethan lowered his head slightly, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement, and the dog mirrored the motion in a way that felt instinctive rather than learned. In that shared stillness, something that had been buried under years of separation began to surface not as memory alone, but as presence returning to its origin. And neither of them moved, because both seemed to understand without needing language that the moment they were standing inside was no longer about recognition alone, but about what recognition had already refused to forget. The air between them seemed to settle into a different kind of silence now, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but charged with something quieter, something that felt closer to recognition than hesitation. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole remained in place, his breathing steady but measured, as if his body was still catching up to a moment his mind had already begun to accept. The German shepherd stood only a few steps away, no longer shifting in cautious distance, but no longer rushing forward either. He held himself with a calm that felt intentional, as though he was waiting for something to be completed rather than initiated. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on him, and for the first time since the encounter began, he allowed himself to look beyond doubt and into detail. The pale coat was clearer now under the morning light, not simply white, but layered with faint tones shaped by time and environment, as if the world itself had left its markings on him. Ethan noticed the way the dog's posture subtly adjusted when he moved his shoulders, not reacting to threat, but tracking familiarity. That small response tightened something in Ethan's chest again, but this time it was not confusion, it was memory aligning itself more precisely. He exhaled slowly, letting the sound fall into the space between them, and the dog's ears shifted in immediate response, as if the sound itself carried meaning beyond noise. Ethan took another step forward, smaller than before, careful not to break whatever fragile connection was forming. The dog did not retreat. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt learned in environments where understanding mattered more than command. Ethan's thoughts returned again to the past, not as a flood, but as fragments becoming clearer, each one sharpening the outline of something he had not allowed himself to fully revisit. He remembered movement through terrain that demanded absolute trust, where hesitation could not exist because survival depended on shared instinct. In those moments, there had been no need for repeated instruction because presence alone had been enough to guide action. His hand rose slightly without intention, stopping midway as if caught between memory and reality, then lowered again. The dog's gaze followed that motion closely, not reacting with tension, but with awareness, as if reading intention before it became action. Around them, the base continued its routine existence, but it no longer felt like part of their space. It felt distant, secondary, almost irrelevant. Ethan finally spoke again, but this time the sound was softer, shaped less like authority and more like recognition being tested against time. The name he used earlier did not come again immediately. Instead, he watched for reaction, and the reaction came not in movement, but in stillness so precise it felt deliberate. The German shepherd held his position, but something in his expression shifted, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a focus that removed everything else from consideration. Ethan's throat tightened slightly as he noticed it, because now the response was no longer uncertain. It was controlled recognition, as if the name had reached a place inside the dog that had been waiting beneath everything else. A faint breath escaped the animal, low and steady, almost like a release rather than a sound. Ethan stepped forward again, now close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation, but like threshold. The dog did not move away. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, aligning his gaze directly with Ethan's, and in that alignment something unspoken settled into place. Ethan's expression softened just slightly, not breaking discipline, but allowing memory to surface. Without resistance, he could feel it now, not as imagination, but as certainty forming slowly beneath the weight of time. The dog's presence was not new. It was returning. And in that return, every year of absence began to feel less like loss and more like distance that had finally found its end. Neither of them moved further, because both seemed to understand that what came next would not be decided by distance or hesitation, but by the simple truth that had already begun to exist between them again. The moment held its shape longer than either of them expected, as if the world had quietly stepped back to give space to something that had been buried for too long to return easily. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole stood close now, close enough that the air between him and the German shepherd felt thinner, more fragile, as if any sudden movement might dissolve what had just begun to form. The dog remained steady, his pale coat catching the morning light in soft variations that made him appear almost unreal against the structured geometry of the base behind him. Yet there was nothing unreal about the way he stood. Every part of his posture carried intention, as if he had crossed a distance far greater than physical miles to arrive at this exact point. Ethan's breathing slowed without conscious effort, his focus narrowing until everything outside this exchange faded into background silence. He studied the dog's face again, but this time not searching for uncertainty. He was searching for confirmation. The memory inside him was no longer fragmented. It was beginning to organize itself into something coherent, something undeniable. The German shepherd shifted his weight slightly, a subtle adjustment that brought him half a step closer without breaking eye contact, and that movement alone tightened something deep inside Ethan's chest. It was not surprise anymore. It was recognition resisting disbelief. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment, as if grounding himself in the present before allowing the past to surface fully. When he looked back up, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough to reflect that something had crossed a threshold inside him. The dog's ears angled forward again, reacting to that shift with quiet precision. Around them, the bass continued its distant rhythm, but even the smallest sounds felt muted now, as if the space had compressed around their interaction. Ethan finally spoke again, but this time the name he had used earlier came more clearly, more certain, carrying less hesitation and more history. The effect was immediate, but not explosive. The German Shepherd did not lunge or break posture. Instead, he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a motion so subtle it could have been mistaken for a blink, and in that moment Ethan felt something inside him unlock. It was not memory arriving all at once. It was memory confirming itself piece by piece, aligning with reality until there was no separation between them. Ethan stepped forward again, slowly, deliberately, until the final distance between them was no longer measured in steps, but in breath. The dog remained still, but his head lowered slightly, bringing him into alignment with Ethan's level, as if erasing hierarchy in favor of something older than structure. Ethan raised his hand again, this time without hesitation, and paused just before contact, as if asking permission without words. The German Shepherd did not move away. Instead, he leaned forward by the smallest margin, closing the remaining space on his own terms. That single movement carried more weight than anything that had happened before it. Ethan's hand made contact gently, resting against the side of the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the coat, and in that instant, years of separation collapsed into something that felt both immediate and impossibly distant. The dog exhaled slowly, a sound that was not distress, not urgency, but release, as if something tightly held had finally been allowed to soften. Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. His hand remained steady, not gripping, not restraining, simply acknowledging presence that had returned against expectation. The German Shepherd stayed close, not pressing forward further, but not withdrawing either, holding a space that felt balanced between memory and reality. The yard around them seemed unchanged. Yet everything within that small radius of contact felt entirely different, as if time itself had adjusted its pace to accommodate what was unfolding. Ethan's expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with command or discipline, but with recognition finally allowed to exist without resistance. And in that quiet connection, there was no longer question or doubt, only the steady realization that some bonds do not disappear with time. They only wait until both sides are ready to remember them again. The contact between them held steady, not in motion but in presence, as if both had finally settled into the same point in time after years of separation that no longer felt entirely real. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole kept his hand resting against the side of the German Shepherd's neck, feeling the calm weight of life beneath the pale coat, steady and unshaken, as though the years that had passed between them had not erased what had been built long before. The dog remained close, no longer testing distance or hesitation, but simply existing within reach as if that was where he had always belonged. Ethan's breathing was controlled, but slower now, not from tension, but from something deeper that had begun to settle into recognition without resistance. The bass around them continued its quiet rhythm, but even that rhythm felt distant, like a world functioning just outside the boundary of something far more personal and contained. Ethan's eyes softened as he finally allowed himself to fully acknowledge what had been forming since the moment this encounter began. This was not a resemblance, not a coincidence shaped by memory. This was presence returning with continuity intact. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, not pulling away, but adjusting his stance so that the contact between them remained natural rather than forced, and that small movement carried more certainty than any confirmation could have provided. Ethan lowered his hand slightly along the dog's neck, maintaining contact, and the dog responded with a quiet exhale that seemed almost like release from something carried too long alone. For a moment, neither of them moved beyond that shared stillness, and, in that stillness, Ethan's mind moved backward again, but this time without fragmentation. The memories did not arrive as broken pieces anymore. They arrived as sequence. He saw movement through unfamiliar terrain, saw coordination without spoken instruction, saw trust that had never required reinforcement because it existed as instinct between two presences moving as one. His expression tightened slightly, not in strain, but in realization that what he had once assumed lost had never truly disappeared from memory itself. The dog's ears shifted again, reacting not to sound, but to subtle change in Ethan's posture, and Ethan noticed it with growing clarity. There was no uncertainty in the animal's awareness now. There was recognition that had already completed its own return long before human acknowledgement caught up to it. Ethan finally let his hand rest more fully against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the reality of contact rather than memory alone. The German Shepherd remained still, but the stillness now felt shared, synchronized in a way that removed any remaining sense of distance between them. Around them, the base continued its operations, yet no one approached, as if instinctively understanding that interruption did not belong in this moment. Ethan's gaze moved briefly across the dog's face again, not searching this time, but confirming what had already become clear. The shape, the presence, the response, all aligned into something that no longer required explanation. The dog took a small step closer, closing the final gap completely, and in doing so pressed fully into Ethan's space without hesitation. That action did not break the moment. It completed it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of time folding back into itself in a way that felt both impossible and inevitable. When he opened them again, his expression had changed in a way that carried quiet acceptance rather than disbelief. The German Shepherd remained beside him, steady and present, as if the years between them had finally been resolved not through explanation, but through return. And in that return, nothing needed to be spoken for the truth to exist fully between them. The world around them felt suspended in a quiet equilibrium, as if the base itself had recognized that something unresolved had finally found its way back into form. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole remained still beside the German Shepherd, his hand resting with steady contact against the dog's shoulder, no longer searching for confirmation, but simply accepting the reality that had already settled between them. The dog stood close, fully within his space now, no longer testing distance or waiting for instruction, but existing with a calm certainty that required no explanation. Ethan's breathing had slowed further, measured and controlled, yet beneath that control there was a depth of emotion that had no urgency to surface fully, only to exist quietly. The pale morning light continued to spread across the yard, softening edges of buildings and vehicles, but none of it felt relevant anymore. Everything had narrowed into this single point of connection that had refused to break under time, distance, or absence. Ethan's eyes lowered slightly, not away from the dog, but into a softer focus that allowed memory and presence to overlap without conflict. He remembered movement, coordination, silence shared between two presences that never needed instruction because understanding had already been established long before commands were spoken. The German Shepherd shifted slightly closer again, not abruptly, but with a natural fluidity that felt like continuation rather than decision. Ethan did not react outwardly, but his expression changed in a way that acknowledged the depth of that movement, as if it confirmed something already understood beneath thought. Around them, the base continued its distant operations, but even the faintest sounds felt detached, as though they belonged to another layer of existence that no longer interfered with this one. Ethan exhaled slowly, then allowed his hand to move slightly along the dog's shoulder, a small adjustment that reinforced contact rather than changed it. The dog responded by settling more firmly into place beside him, aligning his body in a way that mirrored Ethan's stillness with precise familiarity. That synchrony carried weight beyond instinct. It felt practiced in a time that had once required absolute trust without hesitation. Ethan's mind drifted once more, but this time the memory did not fragment or resist clarity. It formed cleanly, showing him not just moments of action, but presence sustained across uncertainty, where survival depended not on control, but on shared awareness. His jaw tightened briefly, not from conflict, but from the recognition that what he had once believed lost had never truly been absent in essence. It had simply been waiting beyond reach. The German Shepherd's gaze remained forward now, not scanning, not uncertain, but steady and composed, as if acknowledging the same truth from the other side of silence. Ethan finally shifted his stance slightly, grounding both feet more firmly on the concrete, and in doing so felt the weight of time between them settle into something quieter, something no longer fragmented. The connection between them did not intensify or change shape. It stabilized, as if returning to its original form after long distortion. Ethan did not speak, because nothing required articulation anymore. The presence beside him was no longer a question-seeking answer. It was continuity restored through recognition that had endured beyond absence. And in that shared stillness, Both remained grounded not in memory alone, but in the undeniable fact that what had once been broken by time had now returned without needing permission to exist again. The stillness that had settled over the yard no longer felt like uncertainty holding its breath, but like something complete that no longer needed to search for itself. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole remained beside the German Shepherd, his hand still resting with quiet certainty along the dog's shoulder, no longer questioning what had already been answered in ways words could not improve. The dog stood fully present now, no longer distant, no longer cautious, but entirely aligned with the space they shared, as if every step that had led here had only been a return to something that never truly disappeared. Ethan's breathing was slow and even, not because he was suppressing emotion, but because there was no need for urgency anymore. The weight that had pressed through him since the first moment of recognition had softened into something steadier, something grounded in acceptance rather than disbelief. Around them, the base continued its distant rhythm, faint movement of personnel, the low hum of activity that belonged to daily structure, but none of it reached them with importance anymore. The world had narrowed again, but this time not into tension, rather into clarity. Ethan looked at the dog beside him, not searching for confirmation now, but observing presence as fact. The pale coat caught the light in soft variation, no longer strange, no longer unfamiliar, but deeply embedded in memory that had finally aligned itself with reality. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, pressing closer with a calmness that carried no hesitation, and in that movement there was no longer separation between past and present. Ethan exhaled slowly and let his hand move with gentle assurance along the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur, and in that contact there was no question left to answer. The dog responded by lowering his head slightly, settling into Ethan's space as if acknowledging not arrival, but return. Ethan's gaze softened, and for the first time since the beginning of this encounter, he allowed himself to stop analyzing and simply experience what was before him. Memory no longer arrived in fragments. It arrived as continuity. He remembered not only the environments they had moved through together, but the unspoken rhythm that had defined those moments, where trust was not built but already assumed, where silence carried instruction more effectively than words. That understanding had never been lost. It had only been waiting beneath time. The German Shepherd's posture remained steady, but there was a quiet ease now that had not been present before, as if recognition had completed a circle that had remained open for too long. Ethan finally shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself fully, and in doing so felt the last remnants of hesitation dissolve into something quieter and more certain. He did not need to speak. The absence of speech was no longer distance, but understanding. The yard around them continued unchanged, yet within that space everything meaningful had already resolved itself. Ethan's hand remained where it was, not as an act of control, but as acknowledgement of presence that no longer required validation. The dog remained beside him, fully settled, no longer searching, no longer waiting, simply existing in the place where recognition had finally become complete. And in that shared stillness, there was no longer any need for return or discovery, because what had once been separated by years had found its way back into something whole, not through explanation, but through the quiet certainty that neither time nor absence had been able to erase what had always remained between them.